page 94, still chapter 3. The exceptional character which written and oral legend nowadays assigns to the year 1937 is seen in the creation of fabricated charges and tortures. But this is untrue, wrong. Throughout the years and decades, interrogations under Article 58 were almost never undertaken to elicit the truth, but were simply an exercise in an inevitably filthy procedure. Someone who had been free only a little while before, who was sometimes proud and always unprepared, was to be bent and punished and pushed through a narrow pipe where his sides would be torn by iron hooks and where he could not breathe, so that he would finally pray to get to the other end. And at the other end, he would be shoved out, an already processed native of the archipelago, already in the promised land. The fool would keep on resisting. He even thought there was a way back out of the pipe. The more time that passes without anything being written about all this, the harder it becomes to assemble the scattered testimony of the survivors. But they tell us that that the creation of fabricated cases began back in the early years of the organs, so their constant salutary activity might be perceived as essential. Otherwise, with a decline in the number of enemies, the organs might, in a bad hour, have been forced to wither away. As the case of Ch.3 makes clear, the situation of the Czecho is shaky even at the beginning of 1919. Reading the newspapers of 1918, I ran into the official report of a terrible plot that had just been discovered. A group of 10 people wanted to, it seems they only wanted to, drag cannon onto the roof of an orphanage, let's see, how high was it, and shell the Kremlin. There were 10 of them, including perhaps women and youngsters, and it was not reported how many cannon there was to be, nor where the cannon were to come from, nor what caliber they were, nor how they would be carried up the stairs to the attic, nor how they would be set up on the steeply sloping roof, and so they wouldn't recoil when fired. How is it that the Petersburg police, when they were fighting to put down the February Revolution, took nothing heavier than a machine gun up to the roofs? Yes, this fantasy, exceeding even the fabrications of 1937, was read and believed. Apparently, it will be proved to us in time that the Gumilev case of 1921 was also fabricated. In that same year, 1921, the Ryazan Cheka fabricated a false case of a plot on the part of the local intelligentsia. But the protests of courageous people could still reach Moscow, and they dropped the case. That year, too, the whole Archipelago committee, part of the Commission of the Use of Natural Forces, was shot. Familiar enough with the attitude and the mood of Russian scientists at the time, and not being shut off from those years by a smokescreen of fanaticism, we can indeed figure out, even without archaeological excavations, the precise validity of that case. Here is what Y. Doyorenko remembers about 1921. The Lubyanka reception cell for those newly arrested, with 40 to 50 trestle beds and women being brought in one after another all night long. None of them knew what she was supposed to be guilty of, and there was a feeling among them that the people were being arrested for no reason at all. Only one woman in the whole cell knew why she was there. She was an SR. The first question asked by Yagura, well, what are you here for? In other words, you tell me and help me cook up the case. And they say absolutely the same thing about the Ryazan GPU in 1930. People all felt they were being imprisoned for no reason. There was so little on which to base a charge that they accused IDT of using a false name. And even though his name was perfectly real, they handed him 3 years by a special board, OSO, under 5810. Not knowing what to pick on, the interrogator asked, "What was your job?" Answer, "A planner." The interrogator, "Write me a statement that explains planning at the factory and how it's carried out. After that, I will let you know how and why you've been arrested." He expected the explanation to provide the hook on which to hang a charge. Here is the way it went in the case of Kovno Fortress in 1912. Since the fortress served no useful military purpose, it was decided to eliminate it. At that point, the fortress command, thoroughly alarmed, arranged a night attack simply to prove its usefulness and in order to stay where they were. The theoretical view of the suspect's guilt was, incidentally, quite elastic from the very beginning. In his instructions on the use of red terror, the Chekist M.I. Aleksandr wrote, "In the interrogation, do not seek evidence and prove that the person accused is acted in word or deed against Soviet power. The first questions should be, what is his class, what is his origin, what is his education and upbringing." Sorry, I cannot talk today. There is your Sapropolite committee for you. These are the questions which must determine the fate of the accused. On November 13, 1920, Dzerzhinsky reported in a letter to the Cheka that slanderous declarations are often given the green light in the Cheka. After so many decades, have they not taught us that people do not return from there? Except for the small, brief, intentional reverse wave of 1939, one hears only the rarest isolated stories of someone being turned loose as a result of an interrogation. And in such cases, the person was either imprisoned soon again, or else he was let out so he could be kept under surveillance. That is how the tradition arose, that the organs do not make mistakes. And what about those who were innocent? In his dictionary of definitions, Dahl makes the following distinction. An inquiry is distinguished from an investigation by the fact that it is carried out to determine whether there is a basis to proceed on an investigation. On scared simplicity, the organs have never heard of such a thing as an inquiry. Lists of names prepared up above, or an initial suspicion, or a denunciation by an informer, or an anonymous denunciation were all that was needed to bring about the arrest of the suspect, followed by the inevitable formal charge. The time allotted for the investigation was not used to unravel the crime, but in 95 cases out of 100, to exhaust, wear down, weaken, and render helpless the defendant so that he would want it to end at any cost. As long ago as 1919, the chief method used by the interrogator was a revolver on the desk. That was how they investigated not only political but also ordinary misdemeanors and violations. At the trial of the Main Fuels Committee 1921, the accused, Makrovskaya, complained that at her interrogation she had been drugged with cocaine. The prosecutor replied, if she had declared that she had been treated rudely, that they had threatened to shoot her, this might be just barely believable. If the frightening revolver lies there, and sometimes it is aimed at you, and the interrogator doesn't tire himself out thinking up what you are guilty of, but shouts, "Come on, talk. You know what about?" That was what the interrogator Kaikin demanded of Skripnikova in 1927. That was what they demanded of Vitkovsky in 1929, and 25 years later, nothing has changed. In 1952, Anna Skripnikova was undergoing her 5th imprisonment, and Sivakov chief of the investigative department of the State Security Administration, said to her, the prison doctor reports you have a blood pressure of 240 over 120. That's too low, you bitch. We're going to drive it up to 340 so you'll kick the bucket, you viper. And with no black and blue marks, no beatings, no broken bones, we'll just not let you sleep. She was in her 50s at the time, and if back in her cell after a night spent in interrogation she closed her eyes during the day, the jailer broke in and shouted, "Open your eyes or I'll haul you off that cot by the legs and tie you to the wall standing up." As early as 1921, interrogations usually took place at night. At that time, too, they shone automobile lights in the prisoner's face. And at the Lubyanka in 1926, according to the testimony of Berta, they made use of the hot air heating system to fill the cell first with icy cold and then with stinking hot air. And there was an airtight cork-lined cell in which there was no ventilation, and they cooked the prisoners. The poet was apparently confined in such a cell, and Berta Gendel as well. A participant in the Yaroslavo uprising of 1918, Vasily Kasyanov, described how the heat in such a cell was turned up until your blood began to ooze through your pores. When they saw this happening through the peephole, they would put the prisoner on the stretcher and take him off to sign his confession. The hot and salty methods of the gold period are well known, and in Georgia in 1926 they used lighted cigarettes to burn the hands of the prisoners under interrogation. In Meteki prison, they pushed prisoners into a cesspool in the dark. There is a very simple connection here. One that once it was established, the charges had been brought at any cost. Despite everything, threats, violence, tortures became inevitable, and the more fanatic and the more fantastic the charges were, the more ferocious the interrogation had to be in order to force the required confession. Given the fact that the cases were always fabricated, violence and torture had to accompany them. This was not peculiar to 1937 alone. It was a chronic general practice, and that is why it seems strange today to read in the recollections of former Czechs that torture was permitted from the spring of 1938 on. There were never any spiritual or moral barriers which could have held the organs back from torture. In the early post-war years, in the Czech Weekly, the Red Sword, and the Red Terror, the admissibility of the torture from a Marxist point of view was openly debated. Judging by the subsequent course of events, the answer deduced was positive, though not universally so. It is more accurate to say that if before 1938 some kind of formal documentation was required as a preliminary to torture, as well as specific permission for each case under investigation, even though such permission was easy to obtain, then in the years 37 and 38, in view of the extraordinary situation prevailing, the specified millions of admissions into the archipelago had to be ground through the apparatus of individual interrogation in specific limited periods, something which simply had not happened in the mass waves of kulaks and nationalities. Interrogators were allowed to use violence and torture on an unlimited basis at their own discretion and in accordance with the demands of their work quotas and the amount of time they were given. The types of torture used were not regulated, and every kind of ingenuity was permitted, no matter what. In 1939, such indiscriminate authorization was withdrawn, and once again, written permission was required for torture, and perhaps it may not have been so easily granted. Of course, simple threats, blackmail, deception, exhaustion through enforced sleeplessness, and punishment cells were never prohibited. Then, from the end of the war and through the post-war years, certain categories of prisoners were established by decree for whom a broad range of torture was automatically permitted. Among these were nationalists, particularly the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians, especially in those cases where an underground organization existed or was suspected. That had to be completely uncovered, which meant obtaining the names of everyone involved from those already arrested. For example, there were about 50 Lithuanians in the group of the Skirias, the son of Pranas. In 1945, they were charged with posting anti-Soviet leaflets. Because there weren't enough prisons in Lithuania at the time, they sent them to camp near Valsk in Archangel province. There some were tortured and others simply couldn't endure the double regime of the work plus interrogation, which the result that all 50 to the very last one confessed. After a short time, news came from Lithuania that the real culprits responsible for the leaflets had been discovered, and none of them knew of the first group had been involved at all. In 1950, in the Kubyshev transit prison, I encountered a Ukrainian from Dena who had been tortured many different ways in an effort to squeeze contacts and names out of him. Among the tortures to which he had been subjected was a punishment cell in which there was only room to stand. They shoved a pole inside for him to hold on to so that he could sleep for 4 hours a day, After the war, they tortured corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences, Levina, because she and the Aleluyevs had acquaintances in common. Wow. I apologize for my reading. That was terrible. I think I'm tired. I've read this before, so this is the interrogations. It's pretty brutal stuff. Don't listen to this. Better have your headphones on. Don't listen to this around family, because it's going to get ugly. Really ugly. Thank you for listening.